In the fierce battles of the Revolutionary War that birthed our nation, both black and white soldiers often fought side by side. Why then do our classrooms seem to neglect the account of so many of our nation's great black leaders? And what spiritual beliefs and influences shape the lives of these great black men and women? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series.
The richest parts of American history is black history, and yet today, so many of us know so little about it.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent.
We have so many cool stories of black and white serving together, fighting together in the Revolution, and yet what we hear today are the real victim stories, which are there. No question they're there, but that's only a part of American history.
Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s.
If you're going to talk about African-American heroes, by and large, you're going to have to talk about some Christians, and since we don't talk about Christians in textbooks, African-Americans really receive the brunt of that.
What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
America has a rich history full of heroes of all types, but the ones we hear the least about are African-American heroes. African-American heroes have been part of American history from the very beginning. Our tendency in textbooks today is when we tell about black history, we start in the 1960s and move forward.
Right.
And that's an important era of history. Dr. Martin Luther King and all the things that went with that, the March through Selma, the March on D.C., it's all important. But that's not where black history starts.
Right.
We have some real heroes of black history that we can take way back to the beginning. Great example is Richard Allen. Richard Allen is an African-American who became the founder of the first black denomination in America. His is a great story. He was raised as a slave in Delaware, living as a slave on a plantation in Delaware. And a Methodist evangelist came riding across that plantation preaching the gospel. Richard Allen hears the gospel, he gives his life to Christ, becomes not only a Christian, he becomes a zealous Christian. Richard Allen started sharing Christ with everything that moved on that plantation. And shortly the slave master became a Christian. The slave master says, "What am I doing owning slaves?" So Richard gets his freedom. Well, Richard wants to keep preaching the gospel. So he walks out of that plantation, walks out of Delaware, going north. He ends up in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia at that time was the nation's third largest city. There were 40,000 people in Philadelphia. You can imagine that being the nation's third largest city. Richard ends up preaching in a church in Philadelphia where he's preaching to 2,000 people a week. Now, that's a mega church today, but that's really a mega church. But, oh, and by the way, it was a white church that he was pastoring back then.
Wow.
No, wait a minute, they didn't do that back then? Oh yeah. There are so many examples of black and white together in early American history. There's definitely racial conflict as you go through parts of history, but there was so much cooperation that we never hear about. And so Richard Allen, great patriot that he is, actually becomes one of the soldiers in the American Revolution. So here's a pastor, he's a soldier in the American Revolution. He gets hooked up with signer of the Declaration, Dr. Benjamin Rush. So here's an Anglo, here's an African-American, they're working together. It's those two guys that formed the first black denomination in America. The AME denomination was founded by a black and a white working together. Then if you take that relationship, move forward a little bit, what you find is the period of what's called the yellow fever epidemic. The yellow fever epidemic of Philadelphia was 1793. It was terrible. No one knew what caused yellow fever back then, and so it terrorized everyone because they were losing about 120 people a day in the city to yellow fever. They were just dying off. 1/10 of the city died in that period of time. There were about 70 doctors in the city. They all left the city because they're scared to death. They're going to get yellow fever. They don't know what causes it. Well, Dr. Benjamin Rush was one of the very few who stayed in the city. He was called the father of American medicine. And the two guys that worked with him to treat yellow fever, the three of them that worked together to service that whole city, you had Dr. Benjamin Rush sign the Declaration, but you had Richard Allen, and you had another black pastor, Absalom Jones. Absalom Jones is the first black bishop in the Episcopal Church, and those three guys treated so much of Philadelphia. So there you've got this huge crisis going on, and what do you have? You have a white and two blacks working side by side to treat that epidemic. Great story of American history, great story of medicine, but we just don't hear it.
Although the history of black Americans begins in 1619 with the arrival of the first slaves in America, the political history of black Americans actually begins in the year 1787, the year in which the American political system was constructed. 1787 was the year the Constitution was written. Today, many critics assert that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, and to prove this, they point to the 3/5 clause, claiming that the Constitution says that blacks are only 3/5 of a person. One of the earliest black Americans to investigate this claim was the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Douglass had been born into slavery and remained a slave until he escaped to New York. 3 years after his escape, he delivered an anti-slavery speech in Massachusetts. He was promptly hired to work for the state's anti-slavery society, and he also served as a preacher at Zion Methodist Church. During Douglass's first years in freedom in the North, he studied at the feet of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who taught him that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. Douglass accepted this claim, and his early speeches and writings reflected that belief. However, Douglass later began to research the issue for himself. He read the Constitution. He read the writings of those who wrote the Constitution, and what he found revolutionized his thinking. He concluded that the Constitution was not a pro-slavery document, but rather it was an anti-slavery document. But if the Constitution is not pro-slavery, then what about the 3/5 clause? Had Douglass not read that clause? Yes, he had. He understood that the 3/5 clause dealt only with representation and not the worth of any person. You see, the Constitution had established that for every 30,000 inhabitants in a state, that state would receive one representative to Congress. The southern states saw this as an opportunity to strengthen slavery. Slaves accounted for much of the southern population. In fact, almost half the inhabitants of South Carolina were slaves. Therefore, slave owners could simply count their slaves as regular inhabitants, and by so doing could almost double the number of their pro-slavery representatives to Congress. Of course, the anti-slavery leaders from the North strenuously objected to this. After all, slave owners did not consider their slaves to be persons, but only property. These slave owners were therefore using their property, that is, their slaves, to increase the power of the slave states in Congress. The anti-slavery leaders fully wanted free blacks counted, but not slaves, if counting slaves would increase the power of slave owners. They understood that the fewer the pro-slavery representatives to Congress, the sooner slavery could be eradicated from the nation. Several other founders, including James Wilson and Elbridge Gerry, even used the slaveholders' own arguments against them. For example, Luther Martin proposed,
if slaves are considered property, then what renders this property different from any other type of property? That is, why should slaves as property be taken into account rather than horses, cattle, mules, or any other type of property?
These anti-slavery founders argued that if the South was going to count its property, that is, its slaves, in order to get more pro-slavery representation in Congress, then the North would count its property, that is, its houses, cows, and horses, to get more anti-slavery representation in Congress. Of course, the South objected just as strongly to this proposal as the North had objected to counting slaves. The final compromise was that only 60% of slaves, that is, 3/5 of slaves, would be counted to calculate the number of Southern representatives to Congress. In other words, it would take 50,000 slaves rather than just 30,000 before slave-holding states could get a representative in Congress, thus greatly reducing the number of representatives to Congress from states with extraordinarily large slave populations. This, then, is the 3/5 clause. It had nothing to do with the worth of any individual. In fact, free blacks in the North and the South often were extended the full rights of a citizen and regularly voted, both in the North and the South. The 3/5 clause had to do only with representation. This is why Frederick Douglass, unlike many today who have never taken time to study the Constitution, could emphatically declare that the Constitution, all of the Constitution, was anti-slavery.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith, and why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Why is it that African Americans particularly are left out of American history?
Well, I think that the answer to that question of why African Americans are left out of American history fits in a bigger scheme of what happens in education. In education, there has been in the last 50 years a real movement to just get God out of history books. We just leave him out. Well, as you look at elements where God has worked, even current polling today, and has for a number of years, shows that the most Christian community in America is the African American community. A higher percent of African Americans are Christians than any other group. So if you're going to talk about African American heroes, by and large, you're going to have to talk about some Christians, and since we don't talk about Christians in textbooks, African Americans have really received the brunt of that. It's pretty difficult to find many African American heroes that were not Christians. And so what happens now, and there's been another tendency in our textbooks. Tendency in our textbooks is when we show heroes, we like to show either victims or angry people.
Right.
We want to show people that were fighting the injustice of the system, that wicked government. We're going to show people who fought it, or we're going to show people who were victimized in some way. And there are plenty of those out there. But there's tons of inspirational stories. That the Absalom Jones and the Richard Allens, and this is another great example. This right here is a document, original document signed by a judge. This is signed in 1814 by a judge named Wentworth Cheswell. And Wentworth Cheswell was a black judge in America in 1814. And by the way, he was elected to office in 1775 in New Hampshire. So here's a judge who's been elected to office for 40 years who's black American. We never hear about African Americans getting elected to office. We thought all that started with Barbara Jordan and Andrew Young back in the 70s. No. African Americans elected to office back in 1775, like Wentworth Cheswell. And interestingly, we don't know about this guy, but he's the guy who lined up with Paul Revere. And when Paul Revere went on his ride, Wentworth Cheswell went on his ride as well. Black and white going to warn Americans the British are coming. So we hear part of the story. We don't hear about Wentworth Cheswell.
In 1789, following the ratification of the Constitution, Congress expanded its fight to end slavery by passing the Northwest Ordinance. That law forbade slavery in any of the federal territories then held. And for this reason, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin all eventually came into the nation as free states. Some years later, in 1808, Congress continued its fight against slavery by abolishing the slave trade. A famous sermon commemorating the abolition of the slave trade was given by the Reverend Absalom Jones, the first black bishop of the Episcopal Church in America. His sermon was delivered in the famous St. Thomas's Church. Very few today know that in 1808 Congress abolished the slave trade, or that Bishop Absalom Jones delivered such a compelling sermon. Although slavery still had not been abolished in all the states, things definitely were moving in the right direction. Yet a major reversal was about to occur. By 1820, most of the Founding Fathers were dead, and Thomas Jefferson's party, the Democratic Party, had become the majority party in Congress. With this new party in charge, a change in congressional policy emerged. Recall that the 1789 law prohibited slavery in a federal territory. In 1820, the Democratic Congress passed the Missouri Compromise and reversed that earlier policy, permitting slavery in almost half of the federal territories. Several states were subsequently admitted as slave states, and for the first time since the Declaration of Independence in the Constitution, slavery was being officially promoted by congressional policy. Several other pro-slavery laws were also passed by Democrats in Congress, including the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. That law required Northerners to return escaped slaves back into slavery or else pay huge fines. In many instances, the law became little more than an excuse for Southern slave hunters to kidnap free blacks in the North and carry them into slavery in the South. Because the fugitive slave law allowed free blacks to be carried into slavery, this law was disastrous for blacks in the North. And as a consequence of the atrocious provisions of this democratic law, some 20,000 blacks in the North completely left the United States and fled to Canada. In fact, the Underground Railroad reached the height of its activity during this period, helping thousands of slaves escape from slavery in the South all the way into Canada simply to escape the reach of the Democrats' fugitive slave law. In 1854, the Democratic-controlled Congress passed another law strengthening slavery, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, thus allowing slavery to be introduced into parts of the new territory where it previously had been forbidden, thereby increasing the national area in which slavery would be permitted. Following the passage of these pro-slavery laws in Congress, in May of 1854, a number of the anti-slavery Democrats in Congress, along with some anti-slavery members from other political parties, including the Whigs, Free Soilers, and Emancipationists, they formed a new political party to fight slavery and secure equal rights for black Americans. The name of that party? They called it the Republican Party. They called it that because they wanted to return to the principles of freedom and equality first set forth in the governing documents of the Republic before the pro-slavery members of Congress had perverted those original principles.
Let's go to the Battle of Yorktown, 1781. That final Battle of Yorktown, in our textbooks, they always show the young general, French general, Marquis de Lafayette, as being a real key to whipping the British, and that's no question about it. He was a real key. And standing right beside him, the pictures they show in the textbooks, is an African American. Now, the African American is James Armistead. Nobody ever talks about him. They just think he's holding the horse for, you know, he's a black, he has to be a slave. He's holding the horse for Lafayette, and that's the only reason he's there. No, he's there because those two guys together that brought an end to the American Revolution. Well, how so? Well, James Armistead was a double spy in the American Revolution.
Oh my goodness.
James, a great story. James Armistead, Virginia, he gets General Cornwallis, the British general, convinced that he's an escaped slave. Oh, I'm leaving these terrible Americans. I'm an escaped slave. Please take me in. You kind British, take me in. And so General takes him in. He starts serving the general, waiting on him, serving his table, serving his food. And he hears all this stuff that the British are doing because Cornwallis is meeting with his generals and he's getting all this information where the generals are about to move and what they're doing. What's he do? Well, he's feeding it back to Lafayette. He's feeding all this information to Lafayette, who takes it to Washington, and they're moving the army around to get ready for all the British stuff. And then Cornwallis, James Armistead's been so faithful to Cornwallis. Cornwallis says, I have a proposal. Would you be willing to be a spy for the British against the Americans? I mean, since you escaped as a slave from America. And so he ends up being a double spy. So what he does, he's already a spy against the British. Now the British think he's a spy against the Americans. So he's feeding the Americans all the great information. He's feeding the British all the wrong information.
Wow.
They end up getting Cornwallis trapped out on the peninsula at Yorktown, where they had the French Navy on one side, the American Army on the other, nowhere for the British to go, they're trapped. How'd that happen? James Armistead feeding them bad information.
That's awesome.
Do you know that black patriot? Literally, you can say that he probably cut years off the American Revolution.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith, and why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Another famous battle in American history is the Battle of Bunker Hill. That's the first real siege type of battle that we had against the British. And there's a famous painting of that battle by John Trumbull. And John Trumbull's the same man who painted all those huge pictures in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol about the American Revolution. But in this painting, the British are literally killing General Warren on the battlefield. They got their bayonets over him, they're stabbing him, and right to the side there's two individuals that are very prominent in the picture that are featured there, and one of them is Lieutenant Grosvenor, who was one of the leaders in the battle. Standing right beside him is a black man, Peter Salem, and nobody ever pays attention. They always watch the guy getting shish kebab by the British with the bayonets.
Right.
Over here you got these two guys standing side by side, black and white standing side by side. The black man, Peter Salem, is the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. He saved hundreds of American lives that day. He received 14 commendations from different commanders in that battle. He received recognition from the Continental Congress. He received recognition from the state legislature. He's the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. I mean, as the Americans were winning the battle and they ran out of ammunition, ran out of equipment, and etc., and that was common in the American Revolution. So now the British turn on them, and they're coming after the Americans. They're slaughtering the Americans. And Peter Salem is able to find the British commander and shoot and kill the British commander, and it just stopped the whole British movement. They didn't know what to do. Allowed all the Americans to get back and regroup and get where they could be saved. So he saved hundreds of American lives that day. We never hear about Peter Salem at all. He's a great hero in the Revolution. Another great man that fought in the Revolution, another story of faith, is Lemuel Haynes. He's a black pastor. He pioneered churches across New England, evangelist. When he heard about the battle, he comes to the battle to defend America from the British attack. And when finally we whip the British at Yorktown and kind of call it quits and they throw up the white flag, he goes back home, goes back to New England, back to his churches. Interesting thing about Pastor Lemuel Haynes, on George Washington's birthday, he would preach a sermon about George Washington, his commander-in-chief with whom he'd served side by side in the American Revolution. We have so many cool stories of black and white serving together, fighting together in the Revolution, and yet what we hear today are the real victim stories, which are there. No question they're there, but that's only a part of American history. So we have another whole part that we rarely deal with, but we used to know this. This is a great example. This is a history book. It's called Services of Colored Americans in the Wars of 1776 and 1812. It's written by an African American named William Nell, and we don't know who he is today. He's the first African American appointed to any post in the federal government. And we're talking back in the 1830s and 40s and 50s here.
When was this published, Dave?
This particular book is published in 1852. He has this book also. This is his bigger book, and this book from William Nell's 1855, and it's called The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. Now, look at the size of that book. I think that's a fairly thick book. And you look at the lettering on the inside, that's a lot of small print. This is just about the colored patriots. We didn't know there was that much involved. See, this is the kind of history we used to know. It's the kind of history we used to teach. We just don't hear it anymore. One of the richest parts of American history is black history, and yet today, so many of us know so little about it.
In 1856, the Republican Party entered its first presidential election. In that election, the Republican Party issued this, its first party platform. It was a short document. There were only 9 planks in the platform, but significantly, 6 of the 9 planks set forth bold declarations of equality and civil rights for African Americans based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The Democratic platform of that year took an opposite position, strongly defending slavery. In fact, it warned,
all efforts of the abolitionists are calculated to lead to the most alarming and dangerous consequences, and all such efforts have an inevitable tendency to diminish the happiness of the people.
Amazingly, according to Democrats in 1856, attempting to end slavery would ruin the happiness of the people. Despite such clear differences, the Republicans lost that election. The next year, 1857, a Democrat-controlled Supreme Court delivered this, the Dred Scott decision, declaring blacks were not persons or citizens, but instead were property and therefore had no rights. In fact, quoting from this infamous decision, Democrats on the court announced that blacks
had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit.
In the 1860 presidential election, Republican Abraham Lincoln ran against Democrat U.S. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Both parties again issued platforms. The Republican platform of 1860 blasted both the Fugitive Slave Law and the Dred Scott decision, and it announced its continued intent to end slavery and secure equal civil rights for black Americans. On the other hand, the Democrats in their 1860 platform praised both the Fugitive Slave Law and the Dred Scott decision. In fact, Democrats even handed out copies of the Dred Scott decision along with their platform to affirm their belief that it was proper to have slavery and to hold African Americans in bondage. It is worth noting that for over a century and a half, Democrats often have taken a position that some human life is disposable, as they did in the Dred Scott decision. In that instance, a black individual was not a life, it was property, and you could do with your property as you wished. Today, Democrats have largely taken that same position on unborn human life, that an unborn human is really just disposable property to do with as one wishes. African Americans were the victims of this disposable property ideology a century and a half ago, and still are today. Consider, although only 12% of the current population is African American, almost 35% of all abortions are performed on African Americans. In fact, over the last decade, for every 100 African American live births, there were 53 abortions of African American babies. Democrats have encouraged this. In fact, congressional Democrats are almost rabidly pro-abortion, and they consistently vote against protections for innocent unborn human life. For over a century and a half, Democrats have wrongly argued that some human life is merely disposable personal property, and black Americans have suffered most under this philosophy.
If you want to move to a different level of great black history, you got to go into the black pastors who had such an impact in the early American era, because you do have Richard Allen, you do have Absalom Jones, but who's ever heard of folks like Andrew Bryant, or John Moran, or Harry Hoosier, or so many others? We don't hear those names today, but they had huge impact. Matter of fact, Harry Hoosier was considered the greatest preacher in the First Great Awakening. Now, in the Great Awakening, we hear folks like Jonathan Edwards or George Whitefield or what. Don't hear about Harry Hoosier. He's a black preacher. Benjamin Rush signed the Declaration and said he was the greatest preacher of any of them. So you have Bishop Asbury, Bishop Coke. You have this black preacher in the First Great Awakening that draws larger crowds than Bishop Asbury, Bishop Coke, all the other famous preachers in the First Great Awakening. Nobody hears his name. But if you think about Harry Hoosier, you go, Hoosier, that's a familiar sounding name. Right. Oh yeah, the Indiana Hoosiers? Right. Named after Harry Hoosier.
Wow.
We don't know that today. We don't hear a thing about that. And without the First Great Awakening, there is no independent America. I mean, Founding Fathers said that, John Adams said that, Benjamin Franklin said that. Well, who's a great leader in the First Great Awakening? Harry Hoosier. There are great black preachers, great heroes, great inspirational heroes. We have great military heroes, but they tended to be Christians. So we hear very little about the wholesome stories. We hear very little about the Christian stories. But let me tell you, one of the richest parts of America's history is what has happened with black Americans in American history.
For more information on the American Heritage Series, or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us to once again view history through a truthful lens. For only when we recognize and embrace God's hand in our history can America become all that it was intended to be. Through Wall Builders, historian David Barton seeks to rebuild the walls of America's unique religious, moral, and constitutional heritage by educating the public and encouraging people of faith to become active in strengthening America's great foundations. For more information on how you can become involved, visit wallbuilders.com.